You were talking about the business of the Beatles,
Yeah.
and this to me is fascinating. When they break up, all
Uh-huh.
right? And who knows who broke, everyone has a theory
I
on
know.
who broke it up.
Everyone knows the Beatles changed the world. Their music shaped generations, their faces became icons, and their story became the stuff of legend. But somewhere inside that legend, a quieter story got buried, one that had nothing to do with screaming fans or sold-out stadiums. For years, Paul McCartney said very little about George Harrison that felt truly honest. But recently, he is finally breaking his silence. What was the secret Paul had been holding all this time? And what does it tell us about the friendship the world almost missed? Join us as we finally step inside a story that changes everything you thought you knew. The friendship history almost forgot. Paul McCartney and George Harrison were not just bandmates. They were not just two guys sharing a stage or splitting royalties. They were brothers, bound together by something deeper than fame, something stronger than any record deal, and something far more complicated than any newspaper headline ever captured. The world watched the Beatles rise, and the world watched them fall apart. But very few people ever stopped to look at what was really happening between Paul and George, the tension that quietly built for years, the silence that stretched across decades, and the regret that only surfaced when it was almost too late. This was not a simple rivalry between two competitive musicians. It was something far more painful than that. It was two people who genuinely cared about each other, who built something extraordinary together, and who still managed to let ego and misunderstanding slowly eat away at everything they had. By the end, Paul would describe George as his little baby brother. He would sit beside him in a hospital room, hold his hand, and laugh with him one final time. And after George was gone, Paul would carry a grief that no interview could ever fully explain. But their story did not begin with loss or regret or broken relationships. It began on a bus with a guitar, a conversation, and two boys who had absolutely no idea they were about to change history. And what happened on that bus set everything else in motion. But the real question is, did either of them ever truly understand what they meant to each other? Liverpool beginnings, the bus ride that built the Beatles. Before the fame, before the screaming crowds, before any of it, there was just a teenage boy on a bus with a guitar and another boy who couldn't stop staring at it because he recognized something in that moment that he couldn't quite explain. Paul McCartney and George Harrison grew up in Liverpool, a city that was loud, working class, and full of energy. And even though they attended the same school, the Liverpool Institute, they existed in slightly different worlds at first. Paul was confident, naturally charming, the kind of boy who made friends easily, while George was quieter, more reserved, the kind of boy who observed before he spoke. But what they shared, what connected them before anything else, was an obsession with music that ran deeper than anything school could offer. It was on the bus to school where everything changed. George had been practicing guitar with a dedication that most boys his age simply didn't have. And when Paul heard him play, something clicked. The two of them began spending hours together going over chords, learning songs, and feeding each other's hunger for American rock and roll. Artists like Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, and Buddy Holly were not just musicians to these boys. They were a completely different world, a louder and more exciting world than anything Liverpool had shown them. George was 2 years younger than Paul, which was a significant gap at that age. And Paul initially took on something of a big brother role, guiding George, sharing what he knew, pushing him to get better. But George absorbed everything at a startling speed. His fingers found chords that other boys his age were still fumbling through, and it became clear very quickly that this was not just a hobby for him. This was his entire identity. When Paul introduced George to John Lennon and the Quarrymen, John was not immediately convinced. George was young, and John could be difficult about who he let into his circle. But George sat down and played, clean, confident, and precise. And that was the end of the argument. He was in. And with that, the foundation of the Beatles was quietly laid. What those boys could not have known, sitting on that bus or huddled over guitars in cramped Liverpool living rooms, was that they were building something the world had never seen before. And at the center of it all was a friendship that felt unbreakable, a genuine closeness that went beyond music and beyond ambition. But what begins as mentorship rarely stays simple, and this one was no exception. The closer they got, the more complicated everything would eventually become. From brothers to bandmates and rivals, fame arrived fast, and it arrived loud. And for a while it felt like the Beatles could do absolutely nothing wrong. The crowds were enormous, the records kept selling, and the four boys from Liverpool became the most talked about musicians on the planet. But fame has a way of rearranging things, and inside the band, it quietly began to shift the balance between Paul and George in ways that neither of them addressed out loud. Paul McCartney was a natural leader, not in a forceful way, but in the way that some people simply take up more space in a room without meaning to. He had strong ideas, he had energy, and he had an instinct for melody that was almost impossible to argue with. And as the Beatles grew bigger, Paul leaned further into that role, pushing his vision for the band's sound, steering sessions, and filling the creative space with a confidence that left little room for anyone else to breathe. George had always been the quieter one, content to support, content to play. But he was growing too. His songwriting was developing into something genuinely original. His interest in Indian music and spirituality was opening up new ideas, and he was arriving at recording sessions with songs that deserved real attention. But the problem was that the attention was rarely there. John and Paul had their partnership, their chemistry, their shared history as the dominant creative force, and George's contributions were often treated as something secondary, something to fit in if space allowed. The resentment didn't explode, it simmered. It showed up in small moments, a dismissed idea, a song left off an album, a session where George sat quietly while Paul repositioned his fingers on the guitar without being asked. And each of those moments added weight to something that was building slowly beneath the surface. George later spoke about feeling invisible inside the band he had helped build, about arriving with songs and watching them get politely set aside, about playing the role of the quiet Beatle while his actual musical identity went largely unexplored. And the painful part was that it wasn't cruelty driving any of it, it was simply momentum. Paul and John had a machine running, and George didn't always fit the gears. By the time the Beatles reached their peak, the friendship was still there, but it was strained and compressed under the weight of unchecked ego and unspoken frustration. The brotherhood hadn't broken yet, but the cracks were impossible to ignore, and the album that would expose every single one of those cracks was already being made. SGT Pepper, the album that divided them. By 1967, the Beatles had already achieved things that no band in history had managed, but Paul McCartney was not satisfied with what they had done. He wanted to push further. He wanted to create something that didn't sound like anything that had ever existed before. And the result of that ambition was Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, an album that the world would go on to call one of the greatest ever made. But behind the celebrated finished product was a recording process that quietly deepened every crack that had already begun forming between Paul and George. Paul was the driving force behind Sgt. Pepper. His energy shaped the album's direction. His ideas filled the sessions, and his vision for what the record should be ran through almost every track. And while that vision produced something genuinely extraordinary, it also meant that the studio became Paul's space in a way that left George feeling increasingly like a visitor, rather than an equal member of the band that was making it. George brought Within You Without You to the album, a deeply personal piece rooted in the Indian classical music tradition he had been studying seriously for some time. It was unlike anything else on the record, meditative and philosophical and entirely his own, but it also existed in isolation from everything around it, recorded largely without the other Beatles present, sitting on the album like a separate world rather than a connected part of a shared creative conversation, and that separation said something that nobody had to spell out. The India trip that preceded and surrounded the Sgt. Pepper period widened the gap even further. George had immersed himself in spirituality, in the teachings of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, in a search for meaning that went far beyond music, while Paul engaged with the experience more lightly, more as a cultural curiosity than a genuine transformation. And what that difference revealed was that these two men were no longer simply moving in the same direction. They were developing into fundamentally different people, with fundamentally different priorities. George was searching for something that the Beatles, and Paul's version of what the Beatles should be, simply could not give him. He wanted depth. He wanted space. He wanted his identity as an artist to be taken as seriously as the partnership that had always dominated. And Sgt. Pepper, for all its brilliance, offered him almost none of that. The album became a landmark that the whole world celebrated, but for George, it represented something far more complicated than triumph. It represented the moment he understood, clearly and quietly, that things inside the band were never going to change on their own. He wasn't just frustrated anymore, he was running out of patience entirely. The day George Harrison walked out. By January of 1969, the tension inside the Beatles had reached a point where the air in the room felt different. The Let It Be sessions were supposed to be something fresh, a return to live performance, a stripping back of the studio complexity that had defined their recent work. But from almost the very first day, something felt wrong. The energy was flat, the conversations were strained, and the creative warmth that had once defined how these four men worked together was barely detectable. George arrived at those sessions carrying new songs, ideas he had been developing quietly and carefully, material that reflected how far he had grown as a writer and as a musician. But the reception he received told a familiar story. Paul had strong opinions about arrangements, about direction, about how things should sound, and those opinions had a way of filling the room completely, leaving George standing at the edge of a creative conversation he was technically part of, but never truly equal in. The moment that history remembers came quietly. George said a few words that landed harder than any argument could have. He told Paul and the others that he would play whatever they wanted him to play, or he wouldn't play at all. And then on the 10th of January, he walked out. He left the session, left the building, and went home. What made the walkout so significant was not the drama of it. It wasn't a screaming match or a thrown instrument. It was the exhausted calm of a man who had simply run out of reasons to keep absorbing what the situation was doing to him. George had spent years feeling like a passenger in a band he had helped build from a Liverpool bus ride. And on that January morning, the weight of all of it finally became too much to carry quietly. He did come back after negotiations and conversations and the move to Apple's basement studios. George returned to finish what would eventually become the Let It Be album. But something had permanently shifted. The walkout had made visible what everyone had been carefully avoiding. The band was fracturing, and the friendship between Paul and George had been exposed as something far more fragile than either of them had perhaps admitted. Those who were present during the sessions described the atmosphere as uncomfortable and heavy. A group of extraordinarily talented people going through the motions, while the thing that had made them extraordinarily quietly drained away. George came back, but the version of him that walked back through that door was not the same, and neither was anything else. The songs that spoke what he couldn't. George Harrison had never been the type to make his feelings loudly known. He wasn't the kind of man who pushed back in the room or forced arguments to their conclusion, but that didn't mean the feelings weren't there. It just meant they found a different exit, and after everything that had built up during the Beatles years, after the dismissed songs and the sidelined ideas and the walkout and the slow erosion of his place inside the band, George sat down and wrote it all out instead. When the Beatles finally dissolved, George didn't grieve the ending the way some might have expected. He exhaled, and almost immediately, the music started pouring out of him in a volume that stunned everyone around him. Songs that had been quietly stacking up for years suddenly had somewhere to go, and the world was about to discover just how much George Harrison had been holding back. Wah Wah was one of the first things he put down, a track that practically vibrated with the frustration of everything he had sat through. The title itself was slang for the kind of headache that comes from too much noise and too little respect, and anyone who listened carefully enough could hear exactly where that feeling had come from. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't meant to be. It was George finally saying out loud what he had spent years swallowing in silence. Run of the Mill went deeper, quieter, and more resigned than the explosive energy of Wah Wah. It spoke about the way relationships corrode when people stop truly seeing each other, about the exhaustion of waiting for things to be different. George never pointed a direct finger, but those close to the situation understood clearly enough who and what had inspired it. Paul reportedly heard it and felt the weight of what was being said, and for the first time began to acknowledge privately what he had perhaps been slow to recognize during the Beatles years, that George's talent had been genuinely and consistently underestimated. That private admission from Paul mattered, not because it repaired anything immediately, but because it was honest, and honesty between these two had been in short supply for a long time. Paul later reflected that he had not always given George the credit he deserved, that the dynamic of the band had made it too easy to overlook what was right in front of him, and by the time he fully understood the scale of what George was capable of, the context in which they had worked together was already gone. George had no interest in being framed as a late bloomer, as someone who only found his voice after the more talented members of his band finally stepped aside because that framing was wrong. The talent had always been there. The songs had always been there. What had been missing was simply the space and the respect to let them exist properly. And just when the world finally understood what George had been capable of all along, he walked into Abbey Road with two songs that would stop everyone in their tracks, including the people who should have seen it coming years earlier. Abbey Road, George finally wins. Abbey Road was supposed to be a farewell, even if nobody said it out loud. The Beatles came back to the studio one final time with the unspoken understanding that this was it, that whatever happened in those sessions would be the last thing they made together. What came out of that final gathering was an album that surprised almost everyone, including the people making it, because the most celebrated contributions didn't come from the partnership that had defined the band for a decade. They came from the quiet Beatle who had spent years waiting for exactly this kind of moment. George Harrison walked into Abbey Road with Something and Here Comes the Sun, two songs that were so fully realized, so emotionally complete, that they didn't need anything added or adjusted or redirected. They arrived whole, and the other Beatles knew it, the producers knew it, and very quickly, the rest of the world knew it too. Something in particular stopped people in their tracks. Frank Sinatra, a man who had heard every kind of love song that the 20th century had produced, called it the greatest love song ever written, and he wasn't alone in that assessment. The song moved with a grace and a depth that felt entirely different from anything else on the record. And it announced George Harrison not as a supporting contributor, but as a songwriter operating at the very highest level. John Lennon, who had never been generous with praise inside the band, and who had his own complicated history with George's growing confidence, acknowledged the quality of what George had brought to Abbey Road. And that acknowledgement meant something, because John did not offer it easily or often, and the fact that even he recognized the shift said everything about how undeniable George's contribution had become. Paul recognized it too, and to his credit, he said so. But the recognition came wrapped in a dynamic that had already calcified. The relationship between them was professional, functional, and largely cold by this point. The warmth of the Liverpool bus rides and the early Quarrymen days had been buried under years of imbalance and unspoken grievance. And while both men could acknowledge each other's talent, acknowledging each other as brothers in the way they once had felt like a much longer distance to travel, Abbey Road gave George the moment he had earned and deserved. The world finally heard him clearly, not as the quiet one, not as the third writer, but as an artist whose voice was distinct and powerful, and entirely his own. But the victory arrived just as everything was ending, and there was something deeply bittersweet about the timing of it all. George had finally won the room, but the room was closing for the last time, and what came after the breakup would reveal just how deep the wounds between them really ran. After the breakup, success, silence, and bitterness. When the Beatles officially ended in 1970, the four men who had spent the previous decade redefining popular music scattered in different directions, each of them carrying their own version of what the band had been and what its ending meant. And for Paul and George, the years that followed were defined not just by remarkable solo careers, but by a relationship that swung between distant silence and open bitterness, without ever quite finding stable ground. Paul released his debut solo album almost immediately, a quiet and deliberately modest collection of home recordings that signaled he was starting fresh on his own terms. And while the critical response was mixed, it established that Paul McCartney alone was still a commercial force. Within a short time, he had formed wings and was producing music that filled arenas and topped charts around the world. The professional momentum barely paused. George's response to freedom was something else entirely. All Things Must Pass arrived like a dam breaking, a sprawling triple album that unleashed years of accumulated songwriting in one enormous statement. It was ambitious and spiritual and deeply personal. This connected with audiences in a way that surprised even those who had already begun to appreciate how much George had been holding back. The album sold in vast numbers and produced one of the defining solo singles of the era. And it announced to anyone still uncertain that George Harrison was not a footnote to a more famous partnership. He was a major artist in his own right. But success didn't soften the edges between them. If anything, it sharpened them. George gave interviews in the early post-Beatles years that were pointed and unsparing. He spoke about the frustrations of the band dynamic with a frankness that left little room for diplomatic interpretation. And Paul was clearly in the frame of much of what was said. The sense of years of quiet grievance finally being spoken at full volume was impossible to miss. The concert for Bangladesh in 1971 showed a different side of the divide. George organized one of the first major benefit concerts in music history, a genuinely groundbreaking act of humanitarian ambition. And when he reached out to Paul about participating, Paul declined. The reasons involved business complications connected to the messy legal aftermath of the Beatles' dissolution. But the refusal stung regardless of the reasoning behind it, and it added another layer of distance to a relationship that was already struggling to find its footing. What made this period so complicated was that underneath the bitterness and the pointed comments, the connection was never fully severed. It was bruised and buried and difficult to access, but it had not disappeared entirely. The silence between them was never quite complete, and decades later, something unexpected would pull them back together into a studio, back into the music, and back toward each other. The Beatles reunion and old wounds reopen. For most of the 1980s, Paul and George existed in a kind of parallel distance, successful in their own separate worlds, occasionally cordial when circumstances brought them together, but never truly close. In the way they had once been, the warmth that had defined their earliest years together remained buried under too much history, too many unspoken things, and too many years of moving in different directions without ever fully addressing what had gone wrong between them. Then John Lennon was killed, and everything shifted in ways that were difficult to articulate. The loss of John did something to the surviving Beatles that no public statement could properly capture. It made the distance between the living members feel suddenly less justified and far more costly, and while it didn't immediately repair what had frayed between Paul and George, it planted something, a quiet awareness that time was not guaranteed, and that the people who had shared something as extraordinary as the Beatles deserved more than polite distance. By 1994, something remarkable was being quietly assembled. Yoko Ono had made available a home demo recorded by John, a song called Free as a Bird, and the remaining three Beatles, Paul, George, and Ringo, were invited to complete it, to add their voices and their instruments to John's recording and release it as a new Beatles single. The project was emotional and technically complex and carried an enormous weight of expectation, and it brought Paul and George back into a creative space together for the first time in decades. George arrived with conditions. He wanted Jeff Lynne involved as producer, a choice that reflected where his trust and his creative comfort sat at that point in his life. And Paul had his own instincts about how things should be handled. The old dynamic had not vanished completely. There were still moments of friction, still the familiar tension of two strong creative personalities with different ideas about how something should sound. But something was different this time. The edges were softer, the argument shorter, and underneath the professional negotiations, there was a genuine tenderness beginning to resurface. Those who were present during the Beatles sessions described moments of real laughter, of old memories being revisited without the bitterness that had previously surrounded them, of two men slowly remembering what they had actually meant to each other before the fame and the pressure and the ego had complicated everything. The music they made together still carried that unmistakable quality that only the Beatles ever produced, and being inside that sound again seemed to move something in both of them. The reunion didn't erase the past. It couldn't. There was too much of it, and it had left too many marks. But it opened a door that had been closed for a very long time. Neither of them knew how little time remained, and when the end came, what happened in that quiet hospital room would redefine everything the world thought it knew about Paul and George. Goodbye to a brother, the regret that remained. In the final years of his life, George Harrison was fighting cancer, and the man who had once walked out of a Beatles session rather than endure another moment of feeling invisible was now facing something that no amount of talent or spiritual wisdom could negotiate with. His body was failing, and the time he had left was becoming measurable in a way that concentrated everything that truly mattered. Paul came to see him, not as a former bandmate managing an awkward obligation, but as someone who genuinely could not imagine a world without the person lying in that hospital bed. And what happened in that room was quietly devastating in the best possible way. The two of them laughed together. They held hands. They sat in the kind of comfortable silence that only exists between people who have known each other long enough to need no performance. All of the arguments, the dismissed songs, the pointed interviews, the Bangladesh rejection, the years of cold professionalism, none of it was present in that room. What was present was something much older and much simpler than any of that. After George died in November of 2001, Paul spoke about him with a grief that was visibly uncontained. He called George his little baby brother, and in those words sat everything that the decades of tension had never managed to destroy. The original bond, the bus ride, the shared obsession with music, the two Liverpool boys who had no idea what they were building. George left behind a tree, planted in a garden as a living symbol of memory and continuation, and Paul tended to it long after George was gone. Some connections run too deep to be broken by anything, even time, even silence, even regret. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.